Why a Soldier buried her photo before the final battle. A WWII love story you'll never forget. The photograph was worn at the edges, creased from countless nights pressed against his chest. The colors faded from months of being pulled from his breast pocket and stared at under the dim light of army-issued candles. In it, a young woman with auburn hair pinned in victory rolls smiled back at him, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that seemed impossible now, in the autumn of 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for what everyone knew would be the final push into Germany. Your subscription is more than a click. It's what helps me keep this channel alive and growing. The paper itself had softened with time and handling, its corners rounded from being folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become permanent memories etched into its surface. The photographer had captured Eleanor mid-laugh, her head tilted slightly to the right, one hand raised as if she were about to tuck a wayward strand of hair behind her ear. Behind her, barely visible in the soft focus of the background, stood the boarding house where she lived with the other factory girls, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that seemed to promise home and safety and all the simple pleasures that war had stolen from the world. Sergeant Michael O'Connor knelt in the muddy foxhole outside Aachen, his hands trembling not from the October cold that seeped through his wool uniform and settled in his bones, but from what he was about to do. Around him the landscape bore the scars of months of fighting, shell craters filled with stagnant rainwater, the skeletal remains of trees stripped bare by shrapnel, the acrid smell of cordite and something else, something worse, that hung in the air like a permanent fog. The small metal tin that had once held his mother's mints, a going-away gift she'd pressed into his hands at the train station in Boston, with tears in her eyes and words of blessing on her lips, now served a different purpose entirely. He could still remember the taste of those mints, peppermint and nostalgia, shared with his younger sister on Sunday afternoons when the world was still whole and the future still held infinite possibility. He placed the photograph inside the tin with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics, his calloused fingers careful not to bend it further. The wax from a candle stub, one of many he'd saved from care packages, hoarding light against the darkness, sealed the edges completely. Then he wrapped the entire tin in his spare undershirt, the cotton soft from countless washings in makeshift laundries behind the lines, still carrying the faint scent of the soap Eleanor had sent in her last package. "What are you doing there, Sarge?" Private Johnson whispered from the next foxhole over, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery that had become the constant soundtrack of their lives. Johnson was barely 19, a farm boy from Iowa with hay-colored hair and the kind of innocence that war was systematically destroying, piece by careful piece. Michael didn't answer immediately. The weight of command, of being responsible for these boys who looked to him for answers he didn't have, pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Instead, he pressed the small package to his lips, inhaling deeply as if he could somehow capture Eleanor's essence through layers of cloth and metal, then began digging a shallow hole in the earth beside him with his trench knife. The soil was cold and hard, resistant to his efforts, mixed with fragments of brick and mortar from buildings that had stood for centuries before becoming casualties of this war. Each scrape of metal against stone seemed to echo in the pre-dawn silence, and more than once he paused, listening for any sign that their position had been compromised. "Insurance," he finally said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name, love and fear and desperate hope, all twisted together into something that hurt to swallow. The photograph was of Eleanor Hayes, and their story had begun 2 years earlier in the most unlikely of places. A crowded USO dance in Chicago, where the music was too loud, the punch was too weak, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the desperate gaiety of wartime. It was October 1942, and the war felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. Distant because Chicago remained untouched by bombs and battle lines, close because every family had someone overseas and every newspaper brought fresh casualty lists that mothers and wives scanned with trembling fingers. The Palmer House ballroom had been transformed for the evening, its usual elegant restraint giving way to an explosion of patriotic fervor. Red, white, and blue streamers hung from the crystal chandeliers like captured flags, and recruitment posters competed for wall space with hand-painted signs reading "Dance for Victory" and "Support Our Boys." The orchestra, a mix of local musicians too old for the draft and music students from Northwestern, played with the kind of desperate energy that comes from knowing this might be the last normal thing they do for a very long time. Eleanor had been working the late shift at Boeing's Willow Run plant, riveting wing sections for B-24 Liberators, when her friend Margaret convinced her to come to the dance. The factory never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the massive assembly line produced bombers that would carry the war to Germany and hopefully bring it to an end. Eleanor's hands bore the permanent stains of her work, small burns from hot rivets, calluses from gripping tools for 12 hours at a stretch, fingernails cut short and practical. But her paycheck was 3 times what she could have made as a secretary or shop girl, and every rivet she placed was another step toward bringing her brother Tommy home from the Pacific. "You need to get out more, Ellie," Margaret had insisted, practically dragging her from the boarding house they shared with 6 other factory girls. Margaret was 20, blonde, and possessed of the kind of irrepressible optimism that made her the unofficial morale officer of their little group. She could find silver linings in 16-hour shifts and make jokes about ration cards that actually made people laugh. All work and no play makes a girl forget she's young. The boarding house was a 3-story Victorian that had seen better days, its paint peeling and its front steps worn smooth by decades of working women coming and going. Mrs. Patterson, their landlady, had strict rules about visitors, curfews, and conduct, but she also understood that these girls were carrying burdens that would have crushed their mother's generation. She looked the other way when they stayed out past 10 on weekends, and she never asked questions about the tears she sometimes heard through thin walls at night. Eleanor had been reluctant. At 22, she felt older than her years, worn down by 12-hour shifts and the constant worry about her brother, somewhere in the Pacific. The last letter from Tommy had come 3 weeks ago, postmarked from somewhere the censors had blacked out, filled with forced cheer and careful omissions that told her more than any uncensored truth might have. He'd written about movies he'd seen, books he was reading, the beauty of Pacific sunsets, but nothing about where he was or what he was doing, or whether he was safe. The silence since then had been deafening. But Margaret had already borrowed her address, blue crepe with a white collar, altered to fit Eleanor's smaller frame with the kind of precise stitching that spoke of Depression-era practicality. And there was something appealing about the idea of pretending, even for one evening, that the world wasn't at war. The dress had belonged to Margaret's older sister, who'd worn it to her own engagement party before her fiancé shipped out to North Africa. Now the sister was a war widow at 24, working as a telegraph operator and jumping every time the bell rang. Eleanor had spent an hour in front of the shared mirror in their boarding house room, learning to pin her auburn hair in the victory rolls that all the magazines proclaimed as patriotic style. Her fingers, more accustomed to industrial tools than hairpins, fumbled with the intricate waves and curls until Margaret finally took over, chattering about movie stars and dance steps while she worked. The result was elegant in its simplicity, practical but feminine, professional but young, the kind of hairstyle that said a woman could build bombers during the day and still be beautiful at night. The walk to the Palmer House took them through downtown Chicago, past the newsboys calling out headlines about campaigns in Italy and the Pacific, past the dimmed storefronts where rationing had reduced window displays to patriotic posters and carefully worded apologies for empty shelves. Street lamps were painted halfway up their poles to comply with blackout regulations that seemed almost silly in the American heartland, but which reminded everyone that nowhere was truly safe, that the war was always present, always waiting. The ballroom at the Palmer House was transformed for the occasion, draped in red, white and blue bunting that couldn't quite hide the elegant bones of the space beneath. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light reflecting off the polished floor, where hundreds of couples moved in practice synchronization to the music of a live orchestra. The band leader, a thin man in his 50s who'd played in speakeasies during Prohibition, announced each song with the kind of theatrical flair that belonged to an earlier, more innocent time. Soldiers in pressed uniforms mingled with defense workers, still carrying the scent of factory oil in their hair, and for a few hours, everyone could pretend they were living in peacetime. The refreshment table groaned under the weight of donated food, cookies made with margarine instead of butter, punch mixed with corn syrup instead of sugar, sandwiches filled with processed meat that bore little resemblance to the roasts of peacetime. But no one complained. Sacrifice was the price of victory, and they all paid it gladly, if not always cheerfully. Michael had noticed her immediately, not because she was the prettiest girl in the room, though she was certainly beautiful in the way that wartime made beauty more precious, more fragile, but because while everyone else was dancing and laughing with the slightly manic energy of people trying desperately to have fun, she stood by the refreshment table with a thoughtful expression, watching the crowd with eyes that seemed to see through the festive facade to something deeper, something more real. He'd been stationed at Great Lakes Naval Training Center for the past 6 months, teaching navigation to young sailors who would soon find themselves in the middle of the Pacific, trying to guide ships through waters filled with enemy submarines and hostile aircraft. It was important work, vital work, but it felt removed from the real war, insulated by layers of bureaucracy and training protocols that sometimes made him feel more like a school teacher than a soldier, which in truth he had been. Before Pearl Harbor, before the world changed forever, Michael O'Connor had taught English literature to high school students in a small town outside Boston, trying to make Shakespeare and Dickens relevant to teenagers who were more interested in baseball and movies than in the eternal truths of great literature. He'd loved that work, loved the challenge of opening young minds to the power of words, the way a well-crafted sentence could change the way someone saw the world. But that life felt like something he'd dreamed now, distant and increasingly unreal. The classroom with its chalk dust and autumn light, the students who called him Mr. O'Connor, and argued about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby, the small apartment where he'd lived alone with his books and his dreams of someday writing something important. All of it had been swept away by the tide of history, replaced by this new reality of uniforms and regulations, and the constant awareness that everything he'd once taken for granted might soon be lost forever. He approached her during a slow number, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade drifting across the dance floor like a gentle promise, its melody weaving through the conversations and laughter with the kind of bittersweet beauty that characterized all the best wartime music. The song spoke of romance and longing, of nights spent dancing under stars that might be obscured by blackout curtains tomorrow, of love that bloomed in the shadow of uncertainty. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, his slight Irish accent evident despite years of trying to hide it. His grandparents had come from County Cork with nothing but the clothes on their backs and dreams of a better life, and their brogue had echoed through his childhood like a song from another world. He'd spent his teenage years trying to sound like a Boston Brahmin, but stress and emotion always brought the old rhythms back to his voice. She looked up at him, tall, dark-haired, with green eyes that held their own shadows, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. There was something in her expression that suggested she'd built walls around herself, barriers that kept the world at a safe distance. Her gaze traveled from his face to his uniform, taking in the crisp creases and polished buttons that marked him as someone still stateside, still safe, still unblooded by real combat. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, transforming her entire face and revealing the warmth that lay beneath her careful reserve. "I'd like that very much," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of Ohio in its soft vowels, the kind of accent that spoke of farmland and small towns and families who'd worked the same soil for generations. They talked while they danced, her hand light in his, their conversation weaving between the music like a quiet river, finding its course through familiar territory. The dance floor was crowded, couples pressed close together in the dim light. But somehow they found their own space, their own rhythm, as if the rest of the world had faded into background noise. She told him about the factory, about the pride she felt building planes that might bring her brother home sooner, about the other girls on her shift who'd become like sisters to her. There was Betty, whose husband was somewhere in Italy, and who hadn't heard from him in 6 weeks. There was Rose, whose boyfriend had been killed at Guadalcanal, and who now threw herself into her work with the kind of fierce determination that was the only thing standing between her and complete despair. There was young Susan, barely 18, who'd come to Chicago from a farm in Wisconsin, and who sent every penny home to help her family keep their land. "We look out for each other," Eleanor said as they swayed to the music, her voice soft but determined. "It's not just the work we do, building those planes. It's knowing that we're all in this together, that every rivet we place is connected to every other rivet, and together they make something that can fly, something that can fight, something that can make a difference. He told her about the base, about the young sailors he trained who seemed to get younger every week, boys fresh from farms and factories who'd never seen the ocean before, finding themselves preparing to sail across it into unknown dangers. He spoke of his responsibility to teach them not just navigation, but the kind of precision and attention to detail that might mean the difference between life and death when they found themselves in hostile waters with nothing but their training and their courage to guide them home. Before the war, I taught high school English, he admitted, and he was surprised by how strange those words sounded now, as if he were describing someone else's life. I used to think that literature was the most important thing in the world, that if I could just get these kids to understand Shakespeare, to really understand him, I could somehow make them better people, better citizens. And now? She asked, her brown eyes reflecting the soft light from the chandeliers overhead. Now I think maybe the most important thing is just helping people find their way home, he said quietly. Whether that's across the Pacific, or across a dance floor, or just across the distance between who they were before the war and who they need to become to survive it. She was quiet for a moment, considering his words while they moved together to the gentle rhythm of the music. Around them, other couples laughed and whispered and held each other close, each pair lost in their own small world of borrowed time and careful hope. "What's your favorite poem?" she asked suddenly, and he was surprised by the question. Most people, when they learned he taught English, either changed the subject or made jokes about grammar and spelling, as if literature were some kind of academic exercise, divorced from real life and real feeling. "Yeats," he said without hesitation. "The Lake Isle of Innisfree." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes thoughtful, and then she began to recite softly, her voice barely audible above the music. "I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade." He stopped dancing, staring at her in amazement, feeling something shift and settle in his chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper place. Here, in the middle of a crowded ballroom filled with people trying desperately to forget the war for a few hours, he'd found someone who understood that poetry wasn't just words on a page, but a way of making sense of the world, of finding beauty and meaning even in the darkest times. "You know it," he said, and his voice held a wonder that made her smile. "My father was a great lover of poetry," she said, a shadow crossing her face like a cloud passing over the sun. "He died when I was 16. His heart gave out during the harvest, but he left me his books. I've read them all twice over, some of them 3 times. He used to say that poetry was proof that human beings were more than just animals, that we could take the worst things that happened to us and transform them into something beautiful." The song ended, but neither of them moved to leave the dance floor. Around them, couples shifted and changed partners, following the social conventions of wartime dances, where no one was supposed to monopolize anyone else's time, where sharing was a patriotic duty. But Michael and Eleanor remained in their own small world, talking about books and dreams, and the strange feeling that they'd known each other longer than the past hour. The orchestra launched into "In the Mood," a Glenn Miller number that had everyone moving faster, laughing louder, spinning and dipping, with the kind of abandoned joy that comes from knowing that tomorrow might bring news that changes everything. But Michael and Eleanor found a quieter corner of the dance floor, moving more slowly than the music demanded, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over them. "Do you come to these dances often?" Michael asked, immediately regretting the banality of the question. But Eleanor smiled, understanding that small talk was sometimes the only way to navigate the dangerous waters of wartime romance, where feelings developed too quickly and separation was always imminent. "This is my first," she admitted. "Margaret's been trying to get me to come for months, but I usually work Saturday nights. We're on rotating shifts at the plant. Someone has to keep those bombers coming." What made tonight different? She considered the question, her brown eyes serious. "I got a letter from my brother yesterday. Or rather, I didn't get a letter. It's been 3 weeks since I heard from him, and I realized I was starting to forget what it felt like to hope for good news instead of just dreading bad news. Margaret said, I needed to remember that life is still happening, even with the war. Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Hope had become a carefully rationed commodity, doled out in small portions to make it last through the long months of uncertainty. Too much hope, and you set yourself up for devastating disappointment. Too little, and you forgot why you were fighting in the first place. "Where is he stationed?" Michael asked gently. "Somewhere in the Pacific. The censors don't let him say where, of course, but from the things he doesn't mention, I think it might be Australia or maybe New Zealand. He's a radio man on a destroyer, the USS Sullivan. He joined up right after Pearl Harbor, before the draft even got to him. Said he couldn't sit home and wait when there was work to be done." Michael recognized the ship name. The Sullivan was a Fletcher-class destroyer that had seen action in several major engagements. He didn't mention this to Eleanor, didn't share his knowledge that her brother was likely in the middle of some of the most dangerous naval operations of the war. Some truths were too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to share. Instead, he said, "He sounds like a good man." "He is. He's 2 years younger than me, but he always acted like the big brother. When our father died, Tommy stepped right into his shoes, helped manage the farm, made sure I could finish high school. When I decided to come to Chicago to work in the factories, he supported me, even though it meant leaving him and our mother to handle everything alone." The music shifted again, this time to "I'll Be Seeing You," a song that had become an unofficial anthem for separated couples across the country. The lyrics spoke of finding reminders of lost love in everyday places, small cafes, parks, familiar stars, and as they danced to its gentle melody, Michael felt the weight of impending separation, even though they'd just met. "Are you shipping out soon?" Eleanor asked, and he heard the careful casualness in her voice, the way women had learned to ask the question that was always on their minds without seeming too forward, too presumptuous. "Not immediately," he said, grateful that he could offer her that much certainty. "I'm training new classes of navigators every few weeks. They need experienced instructors stateside, at least for now. But eventually," he left the sentence hanging, unfinished, because they both knew how it ended. She nodded, accepting the partial truth because it was better than no truth at all. In wartime, people learn to live with incomplete information, to build relationships on fragments and hope, and the willingness to take what happiness they could find, for as long as they could find it. They saw each other every weekend for the next month, meeting at coffee shops downtown, where the windows were painted with patriotic slogans and the sugar was strictly rationed, walking through Lincoln Park, where autumn leaves crunched underfoot, and the lake stretched grey and endless toward a horizon that seemed to hold all the world's uncertainties. These dates became the anchor points of their weeks, the bright spots that made the daily grind of war work bearable. Eleanor would take the streetcar in from the factory district, still wearing her work clothes more often than not, practical dresses in dark colors that wouldn't show the oil stains, sturdy shoes that could withstand 12 hours on concrete floors, her hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that spoke of early mornings and late nights spent building the machines of war. She always brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, ham when she could get it, cheese when she couldn't, sometimes just butter and jam when the ration points had run out. And Michael would bring a small volume of poetry he carried in his jacket pocket, a leather-bound collection of Yeats and Frost and Dickinson that had been his father's before the older man's death in 1938. They would find a bench overlooking the lake, or a quiet spot under the trees, and Michael would read to her while she listened with the kind of attention that most people reserved for sermons or love letters. She had opinions about the poems, insights that surprised him with their depth and originality. She understood that Frost's roads diverging in yellow woods weren't really about roads at all, that Dickinson's flies buzzing in windows were messengers from a world beyond the one they could see, that poetry was a way of speaking truths too complex for ordinary language. "Do you ever think about writing poetry yourself?" she asked him one afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the zoo, watching children play while their mothers knitted socks for soldiers and kept one eye on the sky, as if enemy planes might appear over Lake Michigan at any moment. "I used to," he admitted. "In college, I thought I might be a poet. I wrote terrible verses about love and loss and the meaning of existence, the kind of overwrought stuff that young men write when they think they're the first people to ever feel deeply about anything." She laughed, a sound like silver bells in the crisp October air. "I'd like to read them sometime. "Oh no," he said with mock horror. "I burned them all in a fit of good sense during my senior year. The world was spared a great deal of pretentious nonsense." "Maybe you should try again," she suggested. "Maybe having something real to write about would make the difference." She learned that beneath his serious exterior was a man who made her laugh, who listened when she talked about her fears for her brother, who seemed to understand the particular loneliness of wartime, even when surrounded by people. He had a way of paying attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the room, even when the room was just a corner booth in a downtown diner where the coffee was weak and the pie was made with margarine instead of butter. Michael discovered that Eleanor was tougher than she looked, that she could work a 12-hour shift riveting wing sections and still have energy to volunteer at the Red Cross on weekends, rolling bandages and packing care packages with the kind of methodical care that suggested each one might save a life. She sent most of her factory wages home to her widowed mother in Ohio, keeping barely enough for herself to pay for her room at the boarding house and her simple meals. When he asked her about it, she shrugged as if it were obvious. "Mother's trying to keep the farm going with just hired help and neighbors," she explained. "The bank's been patient, but patience doesn't pay mortgages. If I can help her hold on to the land until Tommy comes home, then we'll still have a place to go back to when this is all over." She had a quick wit and a generous heart, and when she laughed, really laughed, it was like music, not the carefully orchestrated music of the dance band, but something more spontaneous and real, like a song someone might hum while working alone, thinking no one was listening. She laughed at his stories about his students, about the boy who'd tried to convince him that Hamlet was really a comedy because everyone dies at the end, about the girl who'd written a paper arguing that Romeo and Juliet would have been happier if they just talked to their parents instead of running off to get married. "Maybe she had a point," Eleanor said one evening as they walked along the lakeshore, the water dark and restless under a sky full of stars that seemed closer than usual, as if the war had somehow compressed the distance between Earth and heaven. "Maybe half the world's problems could be solved if people just talked to each other instead of making assumptions." "Spoken like someone who's never met a teenager," Michael replied. "Trust me, Romeo wasn't listening to anyone except his hormones." On a cold November evening, as they sat on their usual bench overlooking the lake, watching the lights of the city reflect off the water like fallen stars, Michael took her hand and said the words they'd both been thinking, but neither had dared to speak. "I'm shipping out soon, probably overseas." Eleanor had known this moment would come. Every woman in wartime did, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the actual pain of it, sharp and sudden in her chest like a physical blow. The sandwich she'd been eating turned to sawdust in her mouth, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at their joined hands and wonder how something that had felt so permanent could suddenly feel so fragile. "When?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm, too controlled, as if she were asking about the weather instead of the end of everything good in her world. 2 weeks, maybe 3. They're not specific about these things. We'll get 72 hours notice, maybe less. She nodded, trying to keep her composure, trying to be the kind of woman who could send her man off to war with a smile and a brave word, the kind of woman who appeared in all the propaganda posters and magazine articles. But inside she was screaming, raging against the unfairness of it all, against a world that could bring two people together only to tear them apart again, against a war that demanded such impossible sacrifices from ordinary people who'd never asked to be heroes. "Where will they send you?" she asked, though she knew he might not be able to tell her even if he knew. "I don't know. Probably the Pacific, given my training background. But Ellie..." He turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry. "I want you to know that these past weeks, they've been the best of my life. You've made me remember who I was before all this, and given me someone to fight for." She kissed him then, long and desperate, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. When they broke apart, she said, "Write to me. Every day if you can. I'll write back, I promise." "Every day," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of precious stolen moments. Michael would come to the factory gates when Eleanor's shift ended, waiting for her in the crowd of families and friends who gathered there every evening, and they would walk through the darkening streets of Chicago, talking about everything and nothing, memorizing each other's voices, each other's faces, each other's dreams for the future they hoped to share. They talked about practical things, where they would live after the war, what kind of work Michael might find, whether Eleanor would want to keep working or stay home with the children they both wanted but were afraid to discuss in detail, as if speaking such hopes aloud might jinx them. They talked about books they would read together, places they would visit, the small daily rituals that would make up their married life once the world returned to normal. But mostly they just held each other, storing up the feeling of being together, of being safe, of being loved. Eleanor learned the exact shade of Michael's eyes in morning light, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the sound of his breathing when he slept during the brief afternoons, when he would nap on the sofa in the boarding house parlor while she darned socks or wrote letters to her mother. Michael memorized the way Eleanor hummed while she cooked simple meals on the hot plate in her room, the gentle efficiency with which she folded his shirts when he brought his laundry to her, the way she looked when she was reading, completely absorbed in whatever book she held. They were married 3 days before his deployment, a simple ceremony at St. Mary's with Margaret as witness and a chaplain who performed 6 such weddings that afternoon. The church was full of couples just like them, young people in love who were running out of time trying to grab hold of happiness before the war swept it away again. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue one from their first dance, carefully cleaned and pressed, and carried a small bouquet of chrysanthemums that Margaret had picked from the boarding house garden. Michael was in his Class A uniform, his hair freshly cut, looking impossibly young and impossibly brave. During the brief ceremony, Eleanor focused on his face, on the way he looked at her when he said his vows, on the weight of the simple gold band he slipped onto her finger, a ring he'd bought with most of his savings from a pawn shop downtown, choosing it not for its size or brilliance but because the shopkeeper told him it had belonged to a couple who'd been married for 50 years before the husband died peacefully in his sleep. "I want us to be like that," Michael had told her when he gave it to her. "I want us to grow old together, to have 50 years of ordinary days and extraordinary love." The reception was held in the church basement, with cake donated by a local bakery and punch made with whatever sugar could be spared. The other couples married that day joined them, along with families and friends who understood that wartime weddings were community affairs, celebrations that belonged to everyone who needed to believe that love could still triumph over fear. There was no time for a honeymoon, no time for the traditional first year of marriage with its gradual adjustment and shared discoveries. They had one night in a small hotel room downtown, holding each other and talking until dawn, making promises and plans for a future that felt both certain and impossibly fragile. Michael told her about his childhood in Boston, about the apartment where they would live when he came home, about the children he wanted to have with her, and the kind of father he hoped to be. Eleanor told him about the farm where she'd grown up, about her mother who would love him because he made her daughter happy, about the brother who would tease him mercilessly but defend him fiercely once he accepted him into the family. They made love with the desperate tenderness of people who know their time is limited, holding nothing back, giving everything they had because they didn't know when they would have the chance again. Afterward, they lay in the narrow hotel bed, Eleanor's head on Michael's chest, listening to his heartbeat and trying to memorize the sound. "Promise me something," she whispered in the darkness. "Anything. Promise me you'll come back. Not just alive, but really back. Don't let the war take away the part of you that writes poetry and quotes Yeats and makes me laugh. Don't let it turn you into someone I don't recognize." Michael was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of what she was asking. He'd seen the men who came back from the First War, had taught some of their sons, had seen the shadows in their eyes that never quite went away. He knew he couldn't promise to return unchanged. No one could make that promise and keep it, but he could promise to try. "I'll do my best," he said finally, "and you promise me something too. Promise me you'll keep living while I'm gone. Don't just wait for me to come back. Keep working, keep reading, keep becoming the woman you're meant to be. I want to come home to someone who's grown and changed and experienced things, not someone who's been frozen in time." "I promise," she whispered, and they sealed the vow with a kiss that tasted of salt and hope and the beginning of goodbye. The next morning at Union Station, Eleanor stood on the platform in her factory coveralls, having come straight from her shift. The station was crowded with similar scenes, wives and mothers and sweethearts saying goodbye to men in uniform, all of them trying to be brave, all of them failing in small, heartbreaking ways. She pressed a small, wrapped package into Michael's hands, the photograph from their wedding day taken by Margaret with her borrowed camera. It wasn't a professional portrait, just a snapshot taken in the church vestibule after the ceremony, but it captured something essential about them, the way they looked at each other as if they were the only two people in the world, the joy and love and hope that not even war could completely extinguish. "So you don't forget what I look like," she said, trying to smile through tears that she couldn't quite hold back. "Never," he whispered. And then the whistle blew and conductors were calling all aboard, and there was nothing left but one final kiss and the terrible business of letting go. The letters began arriving 2 weeks later, postmarked from various training camps across the country, each one a lifeline thrown across the growing distance between them. Eleanor would rush home from the factory each evening, her heart racing every time she saw the familiar handwriting on an envelope waiting on the boarding house's mail table, mixed in with letters for the other girls. Communications from brothers and boyfriends and husbands scattered across the globe like seeds thrown by an indifferent wind. She developed a ritual around reading his letters. First, she would take them to her room and change out of her work clothes, washing the oil and metal dust from her hands with the careful attention of someone preparing for a sacred ceremony. Then she would sit on her narrow bed, back against the wall, and open each envelope with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious texts. She read every letter 3 times, once quickly, hungry for news, then slowly, savoring each word, and finally aloud to herself, hearing his voice in the careful formation of sentences that had traveled thousands of miles to reach her. "My dearest Ellie," one of the first letters began, written from a training camp in Georgia where the red clay dust got into everything and the heat was like nothing he'd ever experienced in New England. "I'm writing this by the light of a single bulb hanging in our barracks, surrounded by the sounds of 50 men trying to sleep on cots that seem designed for people half our size. But all I can think about is you, about the way you looked that last morning at the station, so beautiful and so brave that I wanted to memorize every detail of your face. The training here is intensive. Navigation, gunnery, radio procedures, all the technical skills they think we'll need when we ship out. But the hardest part isn't the physical demands or even the knowledge we have to absorb. It's learning to live with uncertainty, to make plans knowing they might change at any moment, to hold on to hope without letting it become expectation. I think of you every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep, and it gives me strength I didn't know I had." She wrote back religiously, sometimes twice a day, once before her shift and once after, sitting at the small desk by the window in her room, using the good stationery she'd bought with her first factory paycheck and saved for special occasions. She told him about the factory, about the new girls who'd joined their shift to replace ones whose husbands had been killed or wounded, about the way the work had changed as production demands increased and corners were cut in the name of speed. "Today we built our 200th bomber," she wrote in one letter, her handwriting neat and careful despite her exhaustion. They had a ceremony with photographers from the newspapers and speeches by the plant managers about how each plane we build brings victory closer. "I thought about you and wondered if you might someday fly in something I helped create, if my hands and your hands might work together across all this distance to bring you home safely." She told him about the other girls in the boarding house, about Margaret's new romance with a sailor stationed at Great Lakes, about Mrs. Patterson's efforts to maintain normalcy by insisting on Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, even when half the chairs around the table were empty. She wrote about the movies she'd seen at the local theater, always war movies now, about the books she was reading, about the victory garden she'd started behind the boarding house where tomatoes and beans grew in neat rows that somehow made the future seem more certain. "I've been reading more poetry," she wrote in response to one of his letters. "There's a book in the library downtown, an anthology of American verse, and I've been working my way through it, trying to understand what makes some poems last while others fade away. I think it has something to do with truth, with the poet's willingness to say things that are difficult or uncomfortable, but necessary. Like this line from Walt Whitman that I copied down, "I am large, I contain multitudes." It makes me think about how we all have so many different selves inside us, and how war asks us to be brave versions of ourselves that we didn't know existed. The letters from England came next, postmarked from bases whose names were blacked out by censors, but whose existence Eleanor could guess from the clues Michael was allowed to share. He wrote about the countryside, green and ancient in a way that made him understand why people had been fighting over this land for thousands of years. He described the pubs where American soldiers gathered to drink warm beer and sing songs from home, about the British families who opened their homes to homesick boys from places like Kansas and Tennessee and Maine. The people here have been at war for 5 years now, he wrote, and you can see it in their faces. Not defeat, but a kind of weary determination that goes deeper than courage. They've learned to live with constant danger, to find joy in small things, to keep going when keeping going seems impossible. There's a woman who runs the pub nearest our base, and she's lost 2 sons and a husband, but every evening she serves drinks to young men who remind her of her boys, and she smiles and asks about our families, and makes us feel human again. I've been thinking about what you said in your last letter, about poetry and truth. There's a chaplain here, Father McKenna, who was a literature professor before he took his vows. He holds discussions about books and poetry in the evenings, and it's remarkable how many of these tough soldiers show up, hungry for something that speaks to the parts of themselves that bullets and bombs can't touch. Last week, we talked about a poem by Wilfred Owen, Dulce et decorum est, and the room was so quiet you could hear the rain on the roof. Poetry doesn't make war noble or glorious, but it makes it bearable somehow, gives us words for things that are too big for ordinary language. Eleanor's life settled into a routine structured around these letters. She worked her shifts at the factory, where production demands had increased to the point where 12-hour days became 14-hour days, and safety protocols were relaxed in the name of meeting quotas. She volunteered at the Red Cross on Sundays, rolling bandages and packing care packages with mechanical precision, her hands busy while her mind wandered to England and wondered what Michael was doing at that exact moment. She learned to live with the constant low-level anxiety that was the price of loving someone in wartime, the fear that lived in her stomach like a cold stone, the way her heart jumped every time she saw Mrs. Patterson coming toward her with a serious expression, the superstitious rituals she developed to ward off bad news. She wouldn't step on cracks in the sidewalk, wouldn't walk under ladders, wore the same dress to work every Friday because that was the day his first letter had arrived. The other girls in the boarding house understood. They all had their own versions of the same fears, their own rituals and superstitions, their own ways of managing hope and terror in equal measure. They looked out for each other, with the fierce protectiveness of people who understood that they were all fighting the same war on the home front, that their strength came from their connections to each other as much as from their connections to the men they loved. "We're somewhere in France now," came the letter in late July 1944, written just after D-Day, though the censors wouldn't let him say that directly. "I can't tell you where, but I can tell you that the countryside here is beautiful in a way that makes this war seem even more obscene than it already did. We're living in what used to be someone's barn, and you can still see evidence of the family that lived here. Children's toys in the yard, a woman's sweater hanging on a line, a vegetable garden that someone planted in hope of a harvest that may never come. The fighting has been hard, Ellie. Harder than any of us expected, and we thought we were prepared for anything. But it's not just the Germans we're fighting. It's the weight of all the destruction, the knowledge that every field we cross, every village we liberate, every mile we advance is paid for with blood and grief and the kind of loss that changes people forever. But I carry your picture everywhere, and thinking of you makes even this place seem less frightening. The other boys tease me about how often I look at it, but I don't care. You're my piece of home, my reminder of what we're fighting for. Last night I dreamed about our first dance, about the way you felt in my arms when we danced to Moonlight Serenade, and I woke up with the melody in my head and your face in my heart." Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce, written by candlelight in her room while the other girls slept, and the factory whistle in the distance marked the changing of shifts. "My darling, I wish I could reach across all this distance and hold you, take away whatever you've seen that's putting shadows in your letters. I know you can't tell me the details, but I can read between the lines, can hear the weariness in your words, even when you try to hide it. You asked me once to keep living while you're gone, to keep becoming the woman I'm meant to be. I'm trying, Michael. I've been promoted to line supervisor at the factory, which means longer hours, but also the chance to train new girls, to pass on what I've learned about precision and pride in work well done. I've started volunteering at the hospital downtown too, reading to wounded soldiers who are recovering from injuries that will send them home. Some of them remind me of you, and I try to give them the kind of comfort I would want someone to give you if you were hurt and far from home. Today we liberated a small village, another letter read. This one written in September as Allied forces pushed deeper into German-occupied territory, and an old woman gave me an apple from her tree. It was the sweetest thing I've tasted since your mother's pie at our wedding. Do you remember how she insisted on making dessert even though sugar was rationed? I saved half of the apple and ate it slowly, pretending I was sharing it with you. The boys think I'm going soft, but I don't care. Love makes you soft in some ways and harder in others. I can face anything knowing you're waiting for me. The French people we're liberating are grateful, but they're also exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical tiredness. 4 years of occupation has taught them to be suspicious of hope, to measure their joy in careful portions. But when they smile, when they really smile, it's like sunrise after the longest night. Yesterday, a little girl gave me a drawing she'd made of an American flag, and I cried right there in the street, not caring who saw me. Summer turned to fall, and the tone of his letters began to change subtly. They were still full of love, still full of plans for after the war, but there was something else now, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a knowledge of things he couldn't share with her, that had settled into his bones like winter cold. We're pushing toward Germany now, he wrote in early October, his handwriting less careful than usual, as if he were writing quickly, urgently. The fighting is harder than it was in France, not just because the Germans are fighting for their homeland now, though they are, and with the fury of desperate men, but because something in us is different too. We've seen too much, done too much. The boy who left Chicago is still here somewhere, but he's buried under layers of experience that I never wanted to have. Sometimes I worry that the man who comes home to you won't be quite the same as the one who left. War changes people, Ellie, in ways that can't be undone with a hot bath and a home-cooked meal. I've seen things that will stay with me forever, done things that seemed necessary at the time, but feel heavy on my soul now. But then I remember your face, your laugh, the way you used to recite poetry while we walked by the lake, and I know that love is stronger than whatever this war has done to me. Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce, written by the light of her bedside lamp, while autumn rain drummed against the boarding house windows. My darling Michael, you could come home missing limbs and I would love you. You could come home changed in ways I can't imagine, and I would love you. You are not just the man I married, you are the man I choose to love every day, whatever that means. Come home to me, and we'll figure out the rest together. I've been thinking about something Father McKenna said in one of your letters, about poetry giving us words for things too big for ordinary language. Maybe that's what love is too, bigger than ordinary language, bigger than the words we use to try to contain it. Whatever you've seen, whatever you've done, whatever you've become, my love is big enough to hold it all. Don't try to be the same person you were when you left. Be whoever you need to be to survive and come home to me. His letters became shorter as the fighting intensified, sometimes just a few lines scrawled on whatever paper he could find, the margins of newspapers, the backs of military forms, even once on a page torn from a book of German poetry he'd found in an abandoned house. But each one ended the same way. I love you beyond words, beyond time, beyond whatever comes next. Eleanor treasured these fragments like jewels, reading them over and over, until she had memorized every word, every loop of his handwriting, every stain or smudge that spoke of the conditions under which they'd been written. She kept them in a shoebox under her bed, arranged chronologically so she could trace the arc of his experience from training camp optimism to combat-tested wisdom, to something approaching exhaustion. The last letter arrived on October 15, 1944, delivered by a postal clerk who didn't know he was carrying what might be a final goodbye. Eleanor found it waiting when she came home from her shift, mixed in with the usual assortment of bills and advertisements and letters for the other girls. But this one felt different in her hands, heavier somehow, as if it carried more weight than mere paper and ink should be able to bear. She took it to her room and sat on her bed, holding it for a long time before opening it. Outside her window, Chicago was settling into evening. Street lights coming on despite blackout regulations, the distant sound of factory whistles marking the end of another day of war production, the voices of children playing in the alley behind the boarding house, their laughter a reminder that life continued even in the midst of global catastrophe. Finally, she opened the envelope with trembling fingers. "My beloved Ellie, we're moving up tomorrow for what everyone says will be the final push. By the time you read this, it will probably be over, one way or another. I can't say where we're going or what we expect to find there, but I can say that I've never been more afraid or more determined in my life. I want you to know that carrying your love with me has made me braver than I ever thought I could be. Not brave in the way that medals are given out for. I'm still terrified every time the shooting starts, but brave in the way that matters most. Brave enough to believe that there's something worth fighting for, something worth surviving for, something worth becoming better for. Whatever happens in the next few days, know that every moment we had together was worth everything, worth the fear, worth the separation, worth whatever price we've had to pay for loving each other in wartime. You made me understand what people mean when they talk about soulmates, about finding the other half of yourself in another person. You made me whole in ways I didn't even know I was broken. Wait for me if you can, but don't stop living if you can't. I want you to be happy, Ellie, with me or without me, but happy. You deserve joy and laughter and all the beautiful things this war has tried to steal from the world. If I don't make it back, remember that loving you was the best thing I ever did, and being loved by you was the greatest gift I ever received. Your devoted husband, who loves you beyond words, beyond time, beyond whatever comes next, Michael." Eleanor read the letter 3 times as was her custom, but the 3rd time she read it aloud, her voice breaking on the final lines. Then she folded it carefully and placed it with the others in her shoebox, and she sat on her narrow bed and wept for everything they'd had, and everything they might lose, and everything she couldn't control. Now, crouched in the foxhole outside Aachen, Michael finished burying the tin containing Eleanor's photograph. He covered it with mud and leaves, marking the spot with a small pile of stones that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Around him, the other men were making their own preparations, checking weapons, writing what might be final letters, saying prayers to gods they'd either found or lost in the chaos of war. "Sarge?" Johnson asked again, concern evident in his young voice. The boy had been asking more questions lately, sensing something in the air, the weight of impending action that pressed down on them all like an approaching storm. Michael checked his rifle one more time, made sure his gear was secure. The weight of command sat heavy on his shoulders. These boys would follow him into whatever hell waited beyond the ridge, trusting him to bring them through alive. Some of them would not be coming back, and that knowledge was a constant ache in his chest, a burden that had nothing to do with the weight of his equipment. "Just making sure something precious stays safe," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the short distance between their positions. At dawn, they would advance on the German positions. Intelligence suggested the enemy was well entrenched, desperate, fighting with the fury of men defending their homeland. Michael had no illusions about their chances. Some of them would not see another sunset. But the photograph would remain here, buried in French soil, a testament to love that transcended war, to hope that survived even in the darkest of times. If he didn't make it through the next day, perhaps someday someone would find it, would see Eleanor's smile and understand that once in the midst of all this destruction, 2 people had loved each other with the kind of fierce tenderness that made life worth living. Perhaps they would understand that burying the photograph wasn't an act of despair, but of faith. Faith that love could survive anything, even death, even the terrible weight of all the things that could not be unsaid or undone. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Michael thought of Eleanor, probably just getting off her shift at the factory, walking home through the quiet Chicago streets with her lunch pail and her tired feet. She would be thinking of him as she did every morning, saying a prayer for his safety before falling into exhausted sleep. She would check the mail table when she got to the boarding house, hoping for a letter, dreading the telegram that might come instead. "I love you, Ellie," he whispered to the dawn, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I love you beyond words, beyond time, beyond whatever comes next." The whistle blew. shrill and urgent in the morning silence. Around him, soldiers rose from their positions like ghosts emerging from the earth, their faces grim with determination and fear. Michael touched the spot where he'd buried the photograph one last time, then picked up his rifle and prepared to follow his men into the unknown. The battle for Aachen lasted 3 days. When it was over, Michael O'Connor was among the wounded, not the dead. A piece of shrapnel in his shoulder and a concussion that left him dizzy and disoriented. As he was being loaded onto a medical transport, his thoughts fuzzy from pain and exhaustion, he tried to tell the medics about the photograph, about the small pile of stones, but his words came out jumbled, and they thought he was delirious. 3 weeks later, recovering in a field hospital in England, he received a package from Eleanor. His hands shook as he opened it, afraid of what it might contain, hoping against hope that it would be something ordinary, something that spoke of normal life continuing despite everything. Inside was a new photograph, this one of her standing beside the Victory Garden behind the boarding house, wearing overalls and a bright smile, holding a bunch of carrots like a bouquet. Her hair was longer now, pinned back in a practical style that spoke of long hours and hard work, but her eyes held the same warmth, the same love that had sustained him through the darkest moments of the past months. On the back, she had written, "For when you need a reminder of what's waiting for you at home." He laughed until he cried, the sound echoing through the hospital ward and bringing curious looks from other patients and nurses. But he didn't care. She was alive, she was waiting, and she had sent him a new picture to replace the one he'd buried in faith and desperation outside Aachen. That night, propped up in his hospital bed with his arm in a sling, he wrote her the longest letter of the war, telling her about the buried photograph, about his promise to come back to her, about how her love had been his shield through the darkest days. "My darling," he wrote, "I buried your picture before the battle because I thought if I died, at least something of our love would remain, hidden and safe in the earth like a seed waiting for spring. But I understand now that our love isn't in a photograph or a letter, or any physical thing. It's in the choice we make every day to keep believing in each other, to keep hoping for a future together, to keep loving even when the world seems determined to tear everything apart. I'm coming home to you, Ellie. Not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but I'm coming home. And when I do, we'll go back to that place outside Aachen and dig up that tin. Not because we need what's inside it, but because it represents something important. The moment when love became stronger than fear, when hope became stronger than despair, when two people who loved each other refused to let the darkness win." Michael O'Connor came home to Chicago in the spring of 1945, thinner than when he left, quieter in some ways, but no less loving. He carried his own wounds, not just the visible scar on his shoulder, but the invisible ones that came from seeing too much, doing too much, surviving when others hadn't. Eleanor met him at Union Station wearing the same blue dress from their first dance, and when she saw him walking toward her through the crowd of returning soldiers, she ran to him without caring who was watching. He looked different, older, more serious, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. But when he smiled at her, when he held her in his arms and whispered her name like a prayer, she knew that the essential parts of him were still there, still intact beneath the layers of experience that war had added. They went home to a small apartment Michael had found near the school where he would return to teaching. It was nothing fancy, 2 rooms and a kitchenette, furnished with second-hand pieces and wedding gifts they'd stored during the war, but it was theirs, a place where they could begin to build the life they'd dreamed of in letters written across an ocean of longing. They never went back to look for the buried photograph. They talked about it sometimes late at night when they lay in their narrow bed and shared the stories of their separation, but they never felt the need to actually return to that muddy field outside Aachen. They had each other, and they had the rest of their lives to make new memories, to build the future they had hoped for during the darkest hours of the war. But sometimes on quiet evenings, Eleanor would catch Michael staring out the window with a distant expression, and she would know he was thinking about that foxhole, about the small pile of stones that marked a moment when love had seemed more important than survival itself. In those moments, she would take his hand and remind him that he had come home, that they had made it through, that their love had indeed proven stronger than war. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once years later, When they were old and their hair was silver and their children were grown, they were sitting on their front porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and something in the slant of the afternoon light had brought the memory back. Burying the photograph instead of keeping it with you? Michael thought for a long moment, his weathered hand holding hers with the same tenderness he'd shown that night in the hotel room when they were young and the future was uncertain. Around them, the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of ordinary life, children laughing, lawnmowers humming, the distant sound of a radio playing music from their youth. "No," he said finally, his voice still carrying the faint trace of the Irish accent that had never quite disappeared. "Because burying it meant I believed in tomorrow. It meant I believed we would have a chance to make new pictures, new memories. It was an act of faith, not fear." He turned to look at her, this woman who had waited for him, who had loved him through separation and war and all the small difficulties of ordinary life that followed. "And faith," he said, "was what brought me home to you." Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart in a crowded ballroom more than 50 years earlier, and squeezed his hand. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their legacy play in the yard, listening to the peaceful sounds of a world at peace. In the end, perhaps that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The photograph might still be there, buried in what had once been a battlefield, but was now probably farmland again, its tin container protecting Eleanor's smile from the elements and the passage of time. Or perhaps it had been found by some farmer working his fields, puzzled by this strange artifact of love and war, this testament to the idea that some things are worth preserving, worth protecting, worth believing in even when everything else falls apart. Either way, it had served its purpose. It had carried two young people through the worst that the world could throw at them, and delivered them safely to the other side of history, where they could spend the rest of their lives proving that love, in the end, really was stronger than anything else. And perhaps that more than any photograph was what had brought Michael home to Eleanor, the faith that love could survive anything, even war, even death, even the terrible weight of all the things that could not be unsaid or undone. They had chosen each other once, in a ballroom full of strangers, and they kept choosing each other every day after, through letters and longing and the long, sweet years of peace that followed. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.